Braunschweig, October 21, 1944. In a temporary courtroom inside Renelberg Prison, a 19-year-old armorer worker named Erna Wazinski stands before a Nazi special court. The charge is plundering after an air raid. Under the decree against public enemies of September 5, 1939, looting in bombed areas carries the death penalty. Within 19 hours of her arrest, the court hears the case, deliberates, and sentences her to die. For a few household items from a damaged building, a teenager will be executed under the guillotine at Wolfenbüttel Prison on November 23, 1944. Decades later, social media will circulate a different story. A starving German boy caught stealing bread, Nazi officers beating him, and 100 American soldiers surrounding them to force the officers to retreat. This film asks a stricter question. What do the archives actually show about starving children, Nazi law, and American troops on German soil? On September 5, 1939, 5 days after German forces crossed into Poland, a new decree appeared in the Reichsgesetzblatt, the official gazette of Nazi law. The Verordnung gegen Volksschädlinge, the decree against public enemies, filled only a few pages, but its language would shape the fate of thousands. The text was precise in its vagueness. Section 1 defined plundering in evacuated or air raid areas as a capital offense. The decree claimed to protect the German community during wartime. In practice, it transformed ordinary theft into a political crime punishable by death. The Reich Ministry of Justice and Nazi legal theorists pushed for harsher penalties across the board. Traditional criminal law had procedures, appeals, graduated sentences. The new decree bypassed these protections. Special courts, the Sondergerichte, received authority to process plundering cases through accelerated procedures. An arrest could lead to indictment within hours. Trials often concluded within a single day. Death sentences followed rapidly. The guillotine at Wolfenbüttel Prison became a routine destination for those convicted under the decree. The wording of the law allowed judges extraordinary discretion. The phrase, exploiting the conditions of war, covered everything from organized looting to desperate hunger theft. A woman taking clothing from a bombed apartment could face the same charge as a gang stripping warehouses. The special court, staffed by politically loyal judges, applied the law with severity. Defense arguments about necessity, youth, or the trivial value of stolen goods carried little weight. The decree's purpose was deterrence through fear, and the system delivered. By the middle years of the war, hundreds had been sentenced to death under the decree. The exact number remains uncertain because many records were destroyed or lost. Post-war legal historians estimate that the Sondergerichte handled thousands of cases involving alleged plundering with death sentences pronounced in a substantial fraction. The guillotine fell on men and women, on adults and teenagers, on habitual criminals and first-time offenders driven by hunger. The Nazi state had created a legal weapon that turned survival instincts into capital crimes. In 1998, the German Federal Parliament passed a law recognizing these verdicts as acts of National Socialist injustice and declaring them void. By then, all those executed were long dead. The contrast between propaganda and practice grew sharper as the war continued. Nazi imagery presented German youth as the Hitler Jugend, disciplined, loyal, and eager to serve. Millions of boys and girls were enrolled in the Hitler Youth Organization by the early 1940s. They attended drills, sang patriotic songs, and prepared for military service. Boys trained with rifles and small arms. Older teenagers served as Flakhelfer, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, manning guns around cities. The regime portrayed this mobilization as evidence of unbreakable morale and the strength of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. Internal reports told a different story. Police files from Berlin, Vienna, Braunschweig, and Ruhr cities documented rising juvenile delinquency between 1943 and 1945. Thefts of ration cards, bread, tobacco, and clothing increased in bomb-damaged districts. Truancy from Hitler Youth activities became common. Black market trading flourished among teenagers who should have been attending ideological training sessions. Gestapo and Kripo situation reports listed these incidents with growing concern. The image of heroic, obedient youth collided with the reality of adolescents struggling to survive in collapsing cities. The legal system responded with the same tools it used against adults. Minors charged with plundering fell under the decree against public enemies. German law defined young persons as those between 14 and 18 years old. At 18, an individual was legally an adult. But even younger offenders could be tried under adult criminal law when authorities deemed their actions serious enough. The special courts made little distinction. A hungry 16-year-old taking bread from a ruined shop faced the same accelerated trial and potential death sentence as a 30-year-old looter. The rationing system added pressure. Bread, meat, and fat rations declined throughout the war. By 1944, many urban residents received fewer than 2,000 calories per day. Allied bombing disrupted distribution networks, destroyed warehouses, damaged railways, and evacuated populations created gaps in the supply chain. Hunger became a constant companion for millions. For adolescents whose bodies required more food than the ration system provided, theft became a survival strategy. The Nazi state, which claimed to defend its people, instead criminalized their desperation. Erna Wazinski's case illustrated the machinery in action. 19 years old, employed in an armaments factory, she lived in Braunschweig, a city repeatedly bombed by Allied air forces. After an air raid, she entered a damaged building and took several household items. The exact nature and value of these items are recorded in her file. They were ordinary objects of minimal worth. Someone reported her. Police arrested her. Within a day, the Braunschweig Sondergericht heard her case, convicted her under the decree against public enemies, and sentenced her to death. Her defense attorney wrote that it was unjustifiable to extinguish the life of a young person for taking objects of very little value. The sentence stood. On November 23, 1944, Erna Wazinski died under the guillotine. Decades later, a German court formally annulled her conviction in 1991, recognizing it as a judicial murder by the Nazi state. By late 1944, the same age cohort faced contradictory roles. Teenagers were drafted into Volkssturm militia units, handed Panzerfausts, and told to defend their cities. Simultaneously, they were prosecuted as public enemies when they stole food. The Nazi system demanded total sacrifice while criminalizing the acts of survival its own policies necessitated. The gap between ideology and reality widened into a chasm. The skies over Germany darkened with bombers. Hamburg, Cologne, Braunschweig, and the Ruhrgebiet endured repeated raids between 1943 and 1945. The Royal Air Force struck at night. The United States Army Air Forces attacked by day. Tonnage figures climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Fires consumed blocks of housing. Food depots, warehouses, and distribution centers burned or collapsed under rubble. Bomb damage maps of Braunschweig and other cities showed vast areas of destruction. Municipal authorities struggled to maintain order. Gauleiters, the regional Nazi party leaders, demanded harsh measures against anyone who exploited the chaos. Public assurances promised that the regime would safeguard the provisioning of the people. Internal reports painted a different picture. Local administrators recorded failing stocks, long queues at distribution points, and rising incidents of looting at ruined shops and warehouses. The machinery of the state, already strained by years of war, buckled under the weight of sustained bombing. the Braunschweig Sondergericht became one of the busiest special courts in the region. Dozens of cases passed through its dockets. The judges, loyal to the Nazi legal philosophy, applied the decree against public enemies with severity. The court sent men and women, young and old, to Wolfenbüttel prison for execution. Erna Wazinski's case was one among many, but her youth and the trivial nature of her alleged crime made her file particularly stark. The public announcement of her execution explicitly linked her case to plundering after a terror attack on Braunschweig. Statistics quantify the scale. Allied air forces dropped approximately 1.4 million tons of bombs on Germany throughout the war. Major cities lost 30 to 50% of their housing stock. Braunschweig suffered particularly heavy raids in October 1944, shortly before Wazinski's arrest. Homelessness surged. Refugees and evacuees crowded into surviving buildings. The food supply chain, already inadequate, fractured further. Police reports documented sharp increases in theft cases, many involving food or clothing taken from damaged structures. The procedural pipeline operated with mechanical efficiency. An arrest for stealing food or household goods triggered a rapid sequence. The accused appeared before the Sondergericht, often within 24 to 48 hours. Trials were brief. Evidence consisted mainly of police reports and witness statements. Defense arguments rarely swayed judges whose primary concern was deterrence. Conviction under the decree led to a death sentence in a substantial number of cases. The condemned were transported to Wolfenbüttel or other execution sites. The guillotine fell. Official notices announced the executions as warnings to others. The Nazi state had transformed hunger into a capital offense and starvation into a legal weapon. Air raids produced both the conditions for desperation and the legal opportunities for draconian punishment. Starving miners, whose bodies required more calories than the ration system provided, became enemies of the people in the eyes of the special courts. Within 6 months of Erna Wazinski's execution on November 23, 1944, American infantry and armored units would operate in many of these same districts. When they arrived, the power to enforce Nazi decrees would begin to slip from German hands. Through field glasses, American officers of the 1st U.S. Army observed the border markers near Aachen on September 12, 1944. The crossing into Germany marked a symbolic and strategic threshold. For the first time since the Napoleonic era, a foreign army prepared to fight on German soil. Aachen, an ancient city and historic seat of Charlemagne's empire, lay directly in the path of advance. Intelligence reports warned of heavy fortifications, determined Wehrmacht resistance, and a potentially hostile civilian population. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges commanded the First Army, a formation that included multiple infantry and armored divisions. The combat units formed combined arms task forces designed to penetrate German defenses. Infantry battalions rode in trucks or half-tracks alongside Sherman tanks, tank destroyers, and self-propelled artillery. Engineers accompanied the columns to clear obstacles and repair bridges. Military police followed to control traffic and manage prisoners. The logistical tail stretched back through Belgium and France, a supply line, carrying fuel, ammunition, rations, and replacement parts. The initial advance encountered the expected resistance. German defenders fought from prepared positions in towns and villages. Some units showed fanatical determination. Others, composed of exhausted veterans and hastily trained replacements, offered only token opposition. American commanders discovered a pattern. Pockets of fierce fighting alternated with towns where civilians simply waited for occupation. The infrastructure of German society was already crumbling. Bombing had destroyed transportation networks, refugees clogged roads, food distribution systems functioned sporadically at best. After-action reports from units entering German towns noted the condition of the civilian population. One typical entry read, "Civilians appear stunned and primarily concerned with food." The dazed expressions, the hollow cheeks, the desperation for bread, all contradicted the image of a unified, defiant enemy nation. American soldiers, trained to expect sabotage and partisan resistance, instead encountered women asking for rations and children watching troop columns with empty eyes. By May 1945, approximately 1.6 million American soldiers would be stationed in Germany. This massive presence transformed the nature of occupation. Frontline units that had crossed the Rhine as assault forces became, by necessity, the first tier of occupation authority. Every town secured required immediate administration. Military government detachments, the specialized units trained for occupation duties, could not cover every location simultaneously. Infantry and armored units found themselves responsible not only for security, but also for basic civil order, food distribution, and prevention of violence. Maps in Corps and Army headquarters began to show more than phase lines and tactical objectives. Staff officers added symbols for displaced persons camps, concentration camp locations, food storage sites, and routes for refugee movements. The war of maneuver was becoming a war of administration. The same officers who planned attacks now planned the distribution of captured food stocks and the establishment of curfews. American soldiers, raised in a democracy and trained to respect civilian authority, confronted a defeated population that included millions of children. Orders from above would shape how they responded to what they saw. In the spring of 1945, a War Department circular distributed copies of Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive No. 1067 to commanders throughout the European theater. JCS 1067 laid out United States policy for occupied Germany in precise, uncompromising language. Germany was to be treated as an enemy state, not a liberated ally. The directive warned explicitly against fraternization or gestures that could be interpreted as sympathy with the German population. Washington expected a clear distinction between occupiers and occupied. The text was detailed and lengthy. It addressed everything from the dissolution of Nazi organizations to the control of German industry. One section covered treatment of civilians. Non-fraternization rules prohibited American personnel from engaging in personal contact with German men, women, and children. Soldiers were not to shake hands, share meals, or attend social gatherings with Germans. Violations could result in disciplinary action. The policy reflected widespread anger at Nazi crimes and a determination to avoid repeating perceived mistakes from the post-World War I occupation. At the same time, JCS 1067 imposed responsibilities on occupation forces. The United States military was required to prevent widespread disease and starvation. This did not mean generous provisioning or economic rehabilitation. Rather, it established minimum standards necessary to prevent complete social collapse. The directive explicitly stated that no steps should be taken toward German economic recovery beyond what was necessary to prevent epidemics and unrest. Food rations for Germans were to be kept below those available to displaced persons from Allied or neutral nations. Another crucial provision addressed justice and protection. The directive ordered that persecution of individuals on grounds of race, religion, or political opinion must cease immediately. American commanders were responsible for ensuring that German authorities under their supervision did not continue Nazi practices. This clause created a legal foundation for intervention in German judicial proceedings. While the United States did not come to Germany as liberators, neither would American officers permit ongoing atrocities under their watch. Military government detachments received training on these principles. At town and county levels, MG officers took responsibility for appointing new mayors, supervising police forces, and overseeing courts. The initial policy was to use existing German administrative structures wherever possible, removing only the most compromised Nazis. German police could continue routine functions. Local courts could hear cases. But significant punishments, especially executions and corporal penalties, required approval from American military government authorities. The contradiction between non-fraternization and the duty to maintain order created tension. Soldiers were told not to befriend Germans, yet they observed civilians in desperate need. Orders forbade giving away rations, but field kitchens often had surplus. The directive said Germany must not be treated as liberated, yet it also said persecution must stop. These ambiguities meant that individual officers made judgment calls based on local circumstances and personal interpretation of their responsibilities. Over subsequent months, non-fraternization rules would be gradually relaxed. The initial absolute prohibition proved unworkable in practice. By mid-1945, regulations allowed limited contact in the course of official duties. By 1946, soldiers could speak with Germans and enter their homes under certain conditions. But in the crucial early period, as American forces first encountered German civilians and witnessed the consequences of Nazi rule, the official stance remained one of stern distance. Protection, when it came, had to be justified in terms of maintaining order and preventing persecution, not personal sympathy. The convoy of trucks and jeeps moved slowly through the streets of Cologne in March 1945. Rubble lined both sides of the road. Building facades stood without roofs or rear walls. The cathedral's twin spires, miraculously intact, rose above the devastation. Soldiers of a United States infantry company scanned windows and doorways for threats. What they saw instead were civilians emerging from cellars and damaged structures. Many were thin, wearing patched clothing. Children appeared at nearly every intersection. Letters sent home by American soldiers during this period described the same scenes repeatedly. The children were everywhere. They waited near field kitchens. They followed jeeps. They asked for chocolate, chewing gum, bread, anything the soldiers might share. Many spoke a few words of English learned from brief contact or pre-war schooling. Brot, bitte? Bread, please, became a familiar phrase. The children's persistent hunger struck many Americans as evidence of the regime's failure to protect its own people. Infantry training manuals had prepared soldiers for fanatic resistance, sabotage, and partisan warfare. The expected threat was werewolf units, Nazi guerrillas hiding among the civilian population. Reality proved different. Oral histories collected by the National World War II Museum include numerous accounts of German children lining up at mess trucks. One veteran recalled that the kids appeared every time his unit stopped, no matter the hour. They were polite, patient, and desperately thin. Medical officers assigned to assess civilian health documented widespread malnutrition. German civilian rations in early 1945 provided between 1,200 and 1,800 calories per day, depending on location and work category. This was below the level needed for long-term health, especially for growing children. By contrast, United States K rations provided approximately 3,000 calories. C rations offered similar amounts. Field kitchens serving hot meals to troops prepared food in quantities that often exceeded immediate needs. The disparity was stark and visible. Official policy discouraged sharing rations with civilians. Commanders worried about supply discipline and the precedent of feeding the enemy population. Yet the practice occurred widely. Soldiers distributed leftover food informally. Some units established feeding points for children, justified as necessary to prevent disorder or to gather intelligence. A GI's letter preserved in archives captures the sentiment. The kids are always hungry. They line up by the truck whenever we stop. Hard to see and not give them something. These encounters shaped American perceptions. The Germans, presented in training as fanatical Nazis, appeared instead as a defeated, exhausted population. Women worried more about rations than ideology. Old men and boys performed forced labor clearing rubble. The children especially evoked sympathy. They had not chosen the war. They represented innocent victims of a criminal regime. This humanitarian impulse existed in tension with official non-fraternization orders and the documented crimes of the Nazi state. The contradiction would soon intensify. As American forces penetrated deeper into Germany, they would encounter not only hungry children in cities, but also liberated concentration camps filled with child survivors. The question of protection would become more complex. Meanwhile, the immediate impact was clear. Many American soldiers, whatever their orders said, found it difficult to treat starving children as enemies. The human response to visible suffering operated alongside military discipline. Commanders would have to balance policy directives with ground-level realities and their own moral judgments about what occupation required. The photograph shows a line of German prisoners of war standing under American guard. Their uniforms vary in fit and condition. Some wear the field gray of the Wehrmacht. Others are dressed in the dark clothing of Volkssturm militia. Several prisoners are visibly young, boys with smooth faces, thin frames, and oversized jackets hanging from narrow shoulders. The caption, recorded by a United States Army photographer, notes the date as April 1945 and identifies the location as somewhere in central Germany. It adds a detail. Prisoners include youths estimated at 14 to 16 years of age. By late 1944 and early 1945, such reports became routine. Intelligence summaries and after-action reports from multiple fronts mentioned the capture of underage enemy combatants. Hitler Youth units deployed in combat roles fought alongside regular army formations. Volkssturm battalions, the last-ditch militia raised from men too old or too young for regular service, included boys as young as 12 or 13. These adolescents manned anti-aircraft guns, dug trenches, and carried Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons into battle against Allied armor. The weapons themselves were lethal, even in inexperienced hands. The Panzerfaust 30 and Panzerfaust 60 were disposable, single-shot rocket launchers designed for infantry use against tanks. Simple to operate, they required minimal training. A Hitler Youth member could learn to fire one in minutes. The warhead could penetrate the armor of most Allied tanks at close range. German commanders distributed thousands to Volkssturm and Hitler Youth units during the final months of the war. American tankers learned to approach towns cautiously, watching for boys hiding in rubble with these weapons. Other standard infantry arms equipped youth units. The Mauser Karabiner 98 Kurz, the German Army's bolt-action rifle, was issued to Volkssturm formations. Machine guns, particularly the MG-34 and MG-42, appeared in defensive positions manned by mixed-stage crews. The Hitler Youth Organization had long included weapons training. By 1945, that training translated into combat deployment. Nazi propaganda celebrated these young defenders as symbols of unyielding resistance. Orders from Hitler Youth leadership directed units to fight to the death rather than surrender. American units confronted the moral and practical complexity of child soldiers. Boys who fired Panzerfausts at tanks were legitimate military targets during combat. Once captured, however, they became prisoners of war subject to Geneva Convention protections. Processing stations tagged and screened prisoners. Medical personnel examined them. Underage POWs, when identified, were segregated when possible from adult prisoners. Camp administrators noted their ages in records. The question of how to treat combatants who were also minors challenged standard categories. The same age group that fought with rifles and rockets included victims of the Nazi system in other contexts. Boys conscripted at 15 might have been arrested for theft at 14. The legal apparatus that criminalized hungry teenagers also armed them and sent them into battle. Some captured youth had been forcibly mobilized. Others had volunteered out of ideological conviction, fear, or social pressure. American interrogators found the full range: fanatical believers, reluctant conscripts, and exhausted children who simply wanted the war to end. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of underage Germans served in combat roles during the final year of the war. Exact numbers remain uncertain. Many were never formally enlisted in regular units, making their presence in battle hard to quantify from official records. Casualty figures for these youth units are fragmentary. What is documented is the pattern. As the military situation deteriorated, the Nazi regime lowered age standards and deployed younger and younger defenders. The ideology that claimed to protect Aryan youth instead consumed it. Within weeks, some of these same boys would appear in Allied documentation not as POWs, but as displaced juveniles, camp survivors, or children in need of food and shelter under American protection. In a requisitioned office in a medium-sized German town, a United States military government officer sits across a desk from a German mayor and police chief. The room is sparse. A map hangs on one wall, file folders stack on the desk, an interpreter stands nearby, though the MG officer speaks adequate German. The date is late April, 1945. The war in Europe will end in less than 2 weeks, but this town has been under American occupation for several days. The subject of discussion is local administration and law enforcement. The German officials expect continuity. They hope to resume normal functions under American supervision. The police chief has prepared a list of pending cases, thefts, assaults, disputes over property in bombed areas. Some cases involve charges under the decree against public enemies. Several defendants await trial or sentencing. The police chief explains the procedures, emphasizing that German law provides for swift justice in plundering cases. He expects the American officer to approve the continuation of these proceedings. The MG officer listens, then refers to his directive. Military government regulations place all executions and significant corporal punishment under Allied control. No death sentences may be carried out without explicit approval from American authorities. Cases involving political or racial persecution are to be suspended immediately. The directive defines American responsibility broadly. Occupation forces must prevent further killings motivated by Nazi ideology or applied through Nazi legal instruments like the decree against public enemies. The conversation illustrates a broader pattern documented in military government records. Across the United States occupation zone, American officers took control of German judicial and police functions. The process varied by location. In some towns, MG detachments arrived with combat troops and immediately dissolved Nazi courts. In others, a transitional period allowed German officials to continue routine work under supervision. But everywhere the principle was the same. Serious punishments required American approval, and laws designed to enforce Nazi racial or political goals were nullified. The structure of military government gave teeth to these policies. MG detachments operated at Kreis, county, and Stadt, city, levels. Officers specialized in public safety, legal affairs, civil administration, and economic control. They had authority to remove German officials, appoint replacements, and suspend any actions they deemed contrary to Allied policy. German police and court personnel who wished to keep their positions quickly learned the new rules. Those who resisted or attempted to continue Nazi practices found themselves dismissed or arrested. Occupation studies and after-action reports document specific incidents where American personnel intervened in German legal proceedings. In one town, an MG officer halted a planned execution of a woman convicted under the decree against public enemies for alleged looting. The German authorities argued that the sentence was legal under existing law. The American officer responded that Allied occupation policy superseded German law and that the execution would not proceed. The woman's sentence was commuted. In another case, American MPs physically prevented German police from beating a suspect during interrogation. The police chief protested that such methods were standard procedure. The American response was that they were no longer acceptable. These interventions were not universal or consistent. The occupation involved thousands of towns and millions of Germans. American forces numbered in the millions, but were spread across a vast area. Not every abuse was witnessed or prevented. Some German officials continued harsh practices in areas with minimal Allied supervision. But the overall shift in power was unmistakable. Nazi officers and judges could no longer freely apply draconian decrees when American troops were present. The military government system created a practical shield against the most extreme enforcement of laws, like the decree against public enemies. The archives contain no record of a company of American soldiers encircling a single boy to prevent his beating for stealing bread. What they do document is a systemic pattern. American commanders blocking or overruling lethal punishments, dismantling Nazi judicial structures, and placing German authorities under constraints that made arbitrary killings difficult. Protection in this context was not a dramatic confrontation, but an administrative reality. Where American power reached, Nazi legal instruments lost their force. On April 4, 1945, units of the 4th Armored Division and 89th Infantry Division approached a complex of buildings near the town of Ohrdruf in Thuringia. Intelligence reports had mentioned a labor camp in the area. What the American soldiers found exceeded their expectations and training. Bodies lay in open pits. Survivors, skeletal and weak, moved slowly through barracks. The smell of death permeated the site. Medical personnel and officers began documenting what they saw. Within days, senior commanders would visit to witness the scene personally. Ohrdruf was a subcamp in the network of forced labor installations feeding the German war effort. Prisoners had been used for railway construction and fortification work. Mortality rates were high. The SS guards, aware of the American advance, had attempted to evacuate or eliminate evidence. Many prisoners had been shot before the guards fled. Those who remained alive were in desperate condition. American troops provided food, water, and medical care. Graves registration teams began the grim work of identifying and burying the dead. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, visited Ohrdruf on April 12, 1945. Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton accompanied him. They walked through the camp, observed the evidence, and spoke with survivors. Eisenhower's reaction was documented in multiple accounts. He stated that he wanted to see the camp personally so that he would be able to testify in the future about what he had witnessed. He feared that, without direct evidence from credible witnesses, future generations might dismiss accounts of Nazi atrocities as propaganda or exaggeration. Eisenhower ordered that the camp be shown to as many American soldiers as possible without interfering with military operations. He arranged for congressional delegations and journalists to visit. The goal was documentation and education. The images and reports from Ohrdruf circulated through Allied headquarters and back to the United States. They provided concrete evidence of systematic killing beyond the normal brutalities of war. The Nazi treatment of prisoners was not merely harsh or cruel, it was criminal policy, implemented through an organized system of murder and neglect. Ohrdruf shaped subsequent orders regarding liberation of camps and treatment of German authorities. The discovery demonstrated that Nazi crimes extended beyond battlefield conduct into the deliberate extermination of civilians and prisoners. This reality strengthened directives to document all findings, preserve evidence, and prevent further killings. Within the logic of military government, Ohrdruf and similar discoveries justified more aggressive intervention in German internal affairs. The regime that had operated these camps could not be trusted with any authority over vulnerable populations. The visit to Ohrdruf occurred on April 12, 1945. Within days, American forces would encounter a much larger camp complex, Buchenwald, near Weimar. While Ohrdruf held hundreds at liberation, Buchenwald contained tens of thousands. Among them were not only adult male prisoners, but also children. The implications would extend the lessons of Ohrdruf into more complex territory. Not just documentation of crimes, but active protection of juvenile survivors whose lives depended on Allied logistical capacity and administrative control. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon of April 11, 1945, a German civilian reported to a United States Army unit that prisoners at Buchenwald concentration camp, located on Ettersberg Hill near Weimar, had risen up and taken control. The SS guards had fled or been overpowered. An underground resistance organization within the camp had armed itself with hidden weapons and coordinated the action as American troops approached. When elements of the 6th Armored Division reached the camp gates, they found prisoners, not guards, in charge. Buchenwald was one of the largest concentration camps in the Nazi system. Established in 1937, it had held approximately 250,000 prisoners over its existence. Around 56,000 died there through execution, medical experiments, starvation, and disease. The camp population at liberation numbered approximately 21,000. The prisoners represented multiple nationalities: German political prisoners, Jews from across Europe, Soviet prisoners of war, French resistance members, Poles, Czechs, and others. The FAMIH Nazi system had concentrated them at Buchenwald for forced labor, punishment, and in many cases, gradual extermination. Among the 21,000 survivors were children. The exact number is documented in multiple sources as approximately 900 to 904 boys. Their presence in a camp designed primarily for adult male prisoners was unusual and the result of deliberate protection efforts. As transports of Jewish families arrived at Buchenwald from other camps during 1944 and early 1945, prisoner functionaries within the camp secretly organized to save the children. The SS regulations called for the extermination of Jewish children. The camp's underground leadership moved boys into Block 8 and later Block 66, designated as Children's Barracks. Antonín Kalina, a Czech communist prisoner who served as a block elder, played a key role in this protection network. He and others arranged for the children to receive better food rations when possible, provided different clothing to disguise them during inspections, and kept them hidden from SS selections. When guards searched for prisoners to deport on death marches, the children were concealed. The prisoner resistance used forged documents, bribery, and deception to keep the boys off transport lists. This informal system operated at great risk. Discovery would have meant death for both the children and their protectors. The arrival of American troops terminated SS authority over Buchenwald. The children emerged from the barracks into the open. Signal Corps photographers documented the scene. One famous photograph shows multiple levels of wooden bunks, each tier filled with emaciated men and boys staring toward the camera. The image would become one of the iconic representations of Nazi camp liberation. For the boys themselves, liberation brought both relief and new challenges. They were free from immediate threat of execution, but they faced severe malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma. Many had lost their entire families. They had no homes to return to. American military authorities, working with international relief organizations, faced the question of what to do with 900 traumatized child survivors. Food and medical care were immediate priorities. Army doctors examined the boys and provided treatment. Field kitchens supplied rations. But longer-term solutions required planning and coordination. The boys could not remain at Buchenwald indefinitely. They needed placement in children's homes, orphanages, or programs that could provide education, psychological care, and eventual emigration to countries willing to accept them. The logistics of moving and caring for these children would test the capacity of Allied occupation structures and relief agencies. But the basic fact was clear. Without American control of the camp and the collapse of Nazi authority, these 900 boys would not have survived. On June 2nd, 1945, a train pulled out of a siding near Buchenwald. The cars carried approximately 500 children and teenagers, all survivors of the concentration camp. Relief workers and a rabbi accompanied them. The destination was Écuisse, a small town in Normandy, France, where a children's home had been hastily prepared. The journey marked the beginning of a complex process of evacuation, rehabilitation, and resettlement that would unfold over subsequent months. The decision to transport Buchenwald children to France involved multiple organizations. The Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, OSE, a Jewish child aid organization, took primary responsibility for arranging the home at Écuisse. Allied military authorities approved the transport and allocated rail capacity. The logistics were challenging. The children were medically fragile. Many suffered from tuberculosis, intestinal diseases, and the long-term effects of starvation. The journey itself posed risks. Trains in post-war Europe moved slowly, often delayed by damaged infrastructure. Food and medical supplies had to be carried on board. Testimony from survivors describes the emotional intensity of the departure. One account, preserved in Yad Vashem archives, notes that the children stormed the train for fear that it would leave without them. The desperate rush to board reflected their traumatic experiences. Trains had previously meant deportation and death. Now a train represented potential escape and safety, but the association with transport triggered panic. Relief workers struggled to calm the children and ensure orderly boarding. Once the train departed, many boys remained anxious throughout the journey, uncertain whether they would truly reach a place of refuge. Écuisse was not intended as a permanent home. The facility served as a transition point. The children stayed for periods ranging from 4 to 8 weeks. During that time, they received medical treatment, adequate food, and initial psychological care. Staff worked to identify family members who might have survived or relatives in other countries. The goal was eventual placement in more stable environments, either reunification with family, adoption, or emigration to Palestine, the United States, or other nations willing to accept child refugees. The numbers are documented across multiple sources. Of the approximately 900 children liberated at Buchenwald, roughly 500 were transported to Écuisse in June 1945. Others went to different locations. Some moved to homes in Switzerland. Some were claimed by relatives who had survived in other countries. A portion remained in displaced persons camps in Germany, while relief agencies worked on their cases. The process was neither quick nor simple. Bureaucratic obstacles, health issues, and political disputes over emigration complicated resettlement efforts. But the basic infrastructure, transport, temporary housing, medical care, and administrative coordination depended on Allied military control of occupied Germany. The contrast with the preceding years was absolute. Under Nazi rule, these boys had been marked for death. Their survival at Buchenwald depended on prisoner resistance and hidden protection networks. Liberation by American forces removed the immediate threat of execution. The subsequent transports to Écuisse and other homes became possible because Allied military authorities controlled the territory, the railroads, and the administrative apparatus necessary to move and care for child refugees. Without that control, without the collapse of Nazi power, these logistics would have been impossible. Photographs from Écuisse show boys in various states of recovery. Some still wear clothing from Buchenwald. Others have been provided with new garments by relief agencies. Their faces show a range of expressions: relief, exhaustion, lingering fear, cautious hope. The children's home at Écuisse operated for several months in 1945 before the majority of its residents moved on to other destinations. By the end of the year, most of the Buchenwald boys had been placed elsewhere. The temporary nature of Écuisse did not diminish its importance. It represented a critical link in the chain from camp barracks to future life. That chain existed only because American troops had advanced into Thuringia, liberated Buchenwald, and established military government structures that enabled relief organizations to function. Protection in this case meant not a single dramatic rescue, but a sustained system of control, logistics, and coordination that allowed hundreds of children to transition from death camps to refugee care, and eventually to new lives. A social media post circulates widely in the 21st century. It tells the story of a German boy caught stealing bread during the final months of World War II. Nazi officers beat him. American soldiers witnessed the scene. Approximately 100 GIs surround the area and force the Nazi officers to retreat, saving the boy's life. The narrative is concise, dramatic, and emotionally satisfying. It presents a clear moral picture: innocent child, brutal enemy, heroic American intervention. The story accumulates thousands of shares and comments. Many readers assume it is documented history. Historians and archivists have searched for evidence supporting this specific incident. The search includes United States Army after-action reports, military government case files, war crimes investigation records, and personal memoirs from soldiers who served in Germany during 1945. No document matching the story has been located. The records contain many accounts of American soldiers encountering hungry German children. They document instances of GIs sharing rations despite non-fraternization orders. They show military government officers halting German legal proceedings and blocking executions. But no file describes a confrontation in which roughly 100 soldiers surrounded Nazi officers to prevent the beating of a single boy for bread theft. This absence does not mean the story is entirely fabricated. It may represent a compressed or misremembered account of real events. Memory, especially second-hand or third-hand transmission, alters details. A smaller incident might grow in retelling. Multiple separate events might merge into a single narrative. The story's themes: starving children, Nazi cruelty, American intervention, align with documented realities. But as a specific historical incident with verifiable date, location, and participants, the bread theft rescue remains unproven. What is documented is the legal and administrative structure that created conditions for such incidents. The Decree Against Public Enemies, issued September 5, 1939, did make theft of food a capital offense. Erna Wazinski, a 19-year-old woman, was executed under that decree on November 23, 1944, for taking household items from a bombed building in Braunschweig. Her case file survives. A German court formally annulled her conviction in 1991, recognizing it as judicial murder. In 1998, the German federal parliament passed a law invalidating all verdicts issued under the decree against public enemies, declaring them acts of National Socialist injustice. By that point, all those executed under the decree were dead. The archives also document the American military government system that dismantled Nazi judicial power. Thousands of pages of occupation records show MG officers suspending death sentences, removing Nazi judges, and placing German police under supervision. These actions were not dramatic confrontations, but administrative decisions embedded in daily occupation work. The cumulative effect was significant. Where American authority was established, Nazi legal instruments lost their force. German officials could no longer freely apply decrees like the Decree Against Public Enemies. Similarly, the liberation of concentration camps and the subsequent care of child survivors are thoroughly documented. Buchenwald was liberated on April 11, 1945. Approximately 900 children were among the survivors. On June 2, 1945, about 500 of these children traveled by train to Équus in France. Lists of names, ages, and nationalities exist in archives. Photographs show the children at the home. Survivor testimony describes their experiences. The chain of causation is clear: American military advance, collapse of SS authority, allocation of resources for childcare, and coordination with relief agencies. This system allowed hundreds of minors to survive who would otherwise have died. The bread theft story functions as a condensed symbol of these broader realities. It captures in a single narrative what the archives show across thousands of documents. A pasty, legal system that criminalized hunger, children caught between survival and ideology, and American power that dismantled Nazi authority. The specific incident may be unverifiable, but the context it represents is not. The question then becomes, is the documented record, though less cinematic than the viral story, in fact showing a larger and more consequential form of protection? The numbers tell a different story than individual anecdotes, but they tell a story nonetheless. By May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, approximately 1.6 million United States soldiers were stationed in Germany. This force included combat divisions, support units, military government detachments, engineers, medical personnel, and logistical troops. Their presence represented not just military victory, but administrative control over the defeated nation. With that control came the power to reshape German society, including dismantling the legal structures that had turned hunger into a capital crime. The decree against public enemies remained on the books after German surrender, but it ceased to function as an instrument of state power. American military government regulations nullified Nazi legal provisions that violated Allied occupation policy. German courts could no longer impose death sentences without American approval. The special courts that had processed plundering cases were dissolved. Judges who had applied the decree faced denazification proceedings. Some were removed from office. Others faced prosecution as war criminals. The legal apparatus that had sent Erna Wazinski and hundreds of others to the guillotine lost its authority. Quantifying the impact of this change is difficult. Archives do not contain comprehensive statistics on how many death sentences were blocked by Allied intervention or how many individuals were saved by the collapse of Nazi judicial power. The absence of events, executions that did not happen, beatings that were prevented, starvations that were interrupted, is harder to document than events that occurred. But the pattern is clear in military government reports. American officers intervened in German legal proceedings. They halted planned punishments. They overruled local authorities. The cumulative effect was that Nazi law lost its power to kill. The liberation of concentration camps provides more concrete numbers. Buchenwald alone held approximately 21,000 prisoners at liberation, including roughly 900 children. Ohrdruf, though smaller, contained hundreds of survivors. Across the American occupation zone, dozens of camps and subcamps were liberated during April and May 1945. Total prisoner populations numbered in the tens of thousands. Without Allied military advance and the defeat of the SS, these individuals would have remained under Nazi control. Many would have died in final evacuations or last-minute killings. The child survivors of Buchenwald offer a specific case study in what protection meant in practice. About 500 boys traveled to Equi. Others went to homes in Switzerland, repatriated to their countries of origin if families could be located, or remained in displaced persons camps while relief agencies worked on placement. The logistics required trains, food, medical care, documentation, and coordination between military authorities and civilian relief organizations. Each element depended on Allied control of the territory and resources. Eisenhower's statement after visiting Ohrdruf captures the broader principle. He said he wanted to witness the camps personally, so he could testify later that these things had happened. The commitment was not just to individual rescues, but to systemic documentation and accountability. The exposure of Nazi crimes through photographs, reports, and witness testimony created a historical record that could not be denied. That record, in turn, supported the legal and political transformation of Germany during occupation and beyond. The post-war German government eventually acknowledged the injustice of Nazi legal proceedings. The 1998 law annulling verdicts under the Decree Against Public Enemies came more than 5 decades after the war's end. By that time, all those executed were long dead, and most of those who might have been protected by earlier Allied intervention had died of natural causes. But the legal recognition mattered. It established in German law that these sentences were not merely harsh or regrettable, but fundamentally unjust, acts of a criminal state that violated basic principles of law. The archives do not show a ring of 100 soldiers around one beaten boy. They show something broader and more complex. Millions of soldiers whose presence ended Nazi Germany's power to enforce its laws, thousands of occupation officials who dismantled the Nazi judicial apparatus, hundreds of children whose survival depended on Allied logistics and administration, and decades of subsequent legal reform, recognizing the criminality of the defeated regime. Protection was not a single confrontation, but a systemic outcome of military victory, occupation policy, and logistical capacity. The final line must be quiet, factual, and respectful. The documented record offers no cinematic scene of 100 Americans surrounding Nazi officers to save a boy stealing bread. But it does provide evidence of a more profound shift. The collapse of a legal system that had made hunger itself a capital offense, the liberation of camps where children were marked for death, and the establishment of authority that prioritized documentation of crimes and prevention of further killing. The bread theft story endures as legend. The archives preserve a more complicated truth about how power, policy, and logistics combined to end a regime whose laws treated starving children as enemies of the state. If you value carefully sourced, fact-based military history, consider supporting the channel.